really use it for this stuff. Hang on a sec. Whoops, got it. A sign came up on my screen. So this nice fellow said, well, if you've got this stuff dragged down to the ditch, we'll chip it for you. And I mean, my golly, that was a marvelous thing. As you see, they did chip it and took the chips away. Actually, one of our neighbors wanted mulch around his trees and some other garden areas. And so he was happy to get chips, which worked out to be a boon for all. The town crew did chip for us for a few days worth, and then I started feeling guilty and offered to pay them because it seemed unfair to have them have essentially what could have been a long-term job for the town. And I think we had 2 or 3 guys, the chipper, the truck to pull it, all of the labor. I think at the time it was $40 an hour, which was a fraction of what it would have cost at the time, and certainly a fraction what it would cost now. At any rate, that worked out very well for us. And after possibly another season of the same sort of work, we got what you see here. There's still plenty of work to be done. You can see that the clearing only went up just so far, but it's quite successful and quite thorough. So what you do next is, well, continued clearing, but this is up so high, we wouldn't have dragged it down. We'd have made brush piles of this and burned them in place up on the hillside. As for here, what you want to do is see what sort of remnant prairie seeds there are, prairie plants. We'd see occasional prairie plants as we walked along the trails, but for a more vigorous restoration effort, we tried burning it, and that would remove the debris and free up any remaining prairie plants to the light from the sunshine. It didn't burn very well. You can see me here walking back and forth, back and forth. The drip torch fuel burned where I put it down, and it maybe burned 2 or 3 feet out from that. And then I would turn around and walk back, and the same thing would happen. And if you walk back and forth enough, eventually you'll get a significant amount of the surface burned. That did work, and it did result in the beginning of regrowth of the surviving prairie seeds and small plants that had survived all those years under the shade. So the first burn of the South Slope, 1998. So it took a couple of years before we got that far. Now that was the south facing prairie slopes. Next steps, we moved up to try to get the savanna in better shape. Here you see we've made brush piles in the photo on the right. Solid cover of brush and small trees, none of them part of what could be called a fire regime, fire dependent. Through history, fires would come through most areas on an irregular basis, but fairly often, say every 3 to 5 years, more often or less often. Early people living there they knew to burn the prairie hillsides on purpose. And that clears off the duff, the old grass, lets the sun warm up the slopes and encourage the grasses and plants to get started earlier and more healthy. This is an oak tree that we freed up from surrounding trees. You can see the stump here, a brush pile down the hill. And we can move. This is a photo of these brown lumps are all brush piles, 8 to 10 feet tall. This was a heavily infested oak savanna. We call this the white oak savanna. All these trees are white oaks and have been freed up from the surrounding smothering vegetation. The trees are called open grown oaks because they grew, as in the first aerial photo you saw, they grew without shade. It's not like a woods where the trees are shade each other and have to grow up straight up to get light. These trees were grown fairly spaced, well spaced out. So they had plenty of light. The branches could reach outward for sun. And you see that that's exactly what they've done. They have branches reaching out to the sides. Anyway, the year that is shown here, we had 150 brush piles in the savannas and surrounding areas. Not just here, of course, but throughout the property. That was a big year of restoration. And what do you do with these brush piles? Well, in the winter, when the fire can't go anywhere because the snow prevents it from spreading, in the winter, you burn brush piles. One of the things you do in the winter. And it's a lot of fun. It keeps you warm and it gets rid of all that debris. You can't get a chipper up the hill to chip the brush piles, and but you can get rid of the brush by burning. We did a lot of brush piles that year. So other aspects of the restoration in the savannas are shown here. This is probably a Bur Oak with other oaks in the background, but you also see that there's spreading, solid spreading brush and small trees, non-oaks as it happens, spreading up the hill. We've made a brush pile. We've cut a couple of trees that were close to the oak. This is not an oak. That's not an oak. What would they be? Well, they could be walnut, they could be cherry, they could be elm. And of course, the brush could be buckthorn, honeysuckle, lots of possibilities. So we gave the oaks, which are fire resistant. These other trees are not fire resistant. So even if there had been continued fire, they would have been sensitive to the fire. They'd have been killed out. They never would have gotten this big. But the oaks are resistant. And so there they are. They'll once again see enough sunlight and be able to grow in a savanna. Here's another view. This is the biggest Bur Oak on the property. It's right near the driveway on Pleasant Valley Road. You can see where we started working our way up the slope, and with plenty of work still left uphill from there. This tree met its end, probably a couple or 3 years later. It was a major job. This is an elm, and that didn't belong there either. It's certainly fire sensitive. You may see this is a white birch, paper birch, and they are also very fire sensitive, but they also provide very good habitat for birds, and besides, they're rather pretty. So we've let many of the birch survive. So you saw what we've done with the brush and the small trees and the branches and slash from the trees. We didn't put the logs from the trees on the burn piles. It seemed very wasteful. We wanted to save anything that was useful. One of our neighbors sells firewood for part of his living, sort of a sideline. But he was eager to get the wood from the trees that we'd cut down. We cut a lot of red and black oaks down. They grow very fast. They're not very fire resistant. And we found that they grew right into the Bur Oaks and the white oaks that are fire resistant, part of a fire regime, a fire dependent regime. And so we removed red and black oaks, and you see them here. Our neighbor came and dragged transported the logs to this common area. And then he cut them up into firewood lengths, split them, and stacked them. We gave him permission to leave them there for a year so that the wood could dry, be suitable as firewood. After which, probably in the fall, late summer or fall, he came and took it all home and sold it off as firewood. So he was delighted because he got all that wood for free. And we were delighted because we got rid of all that wood for free. And so it was a win-win, and we're all happy to see that happen. So we've gotten rid of a lot of the brush, a lot of the invasive trees, a lot of the big old buckthorn trees. They've either been burned or made into firewood. But there are some special kinds of tree that you have to be more careful or more recognized that they're different. Black walnut is one such tree. The wood from walnut is quite valuable. And so you wouldn't want to just pile it onto a burn pile or split it up into firewood. We cut those walnuts, and some of them were very big. As you can see on the right there, that tiny little knife it's a little pocket knife, maybe 2.5 inches long. So the tree is pretty big. It's probably 20 inches, maybe 2 feet in diameter. There were a lot of walnut logs. And so we wanted them to be used, but what do you do? Well, if you're lucky, you have a neighbor who has a skid steer, which he could bring on his tractor, and you put the leading edge of the log, lift it up by the skid steer, and pull them out down to the road. The important part here is in the winter, this is easy to do. The ground is frozen hard as a rock, and so you're not damaging any of the property. You don't damage the plants that you're dragging over. You don't gouge deep holes in the ground. Other neighbors that we had heard of had hired or had let logging companies come in and take care of their forests, but that brings in very heavy equipment. You don't get rid of the brush, they leave that behind. And they also often will cut the white oaks that are quite desirable to leave on your property. And so we were very fortunate in having yet a different neighbor who was willing to do this for us. The logs were removed and made into furniture. Actually, the granddaughter of Aldo Leopold lives down the road on Pleasant Valley Road. And she and her husband were happy to get the logs. They had them cut into boards. They dried the boards in their garage. And then they were made into the furniture that's in the Aldo Leopold Center up in Baraboo. They built a new green building, and we were very happy and pleased to see that our walnut logs are made into rather attractive furniture for that building. Other logs were given to a friend who was building a house, and those logs turned into her cabinets and part of their flooring. So that's a good use for walnut. Another kind of tree to get rid of in a special way is an aspen. Aspen grow as clones. They're clonal species. And as you see, there are dozens and dozens of aspen here. And if you cut them, they respond by sending out many more runners for their clone and come back with many times as many trees as you started with. The way to get rid of them is to girdle them, as you see being done here. You peel off the outer bark and the cambium so that the tree can't send the nutrients that are made during photosynthesis in the upper part of the tree. They can't send the nutrients down to the roots. Takes more than a year for the tree to realize that it's dead. It will even put out leaves the second year, but they don't last, and the tree dies, and then you can cut it down. And we had a lot of aspen burn piles that year, or those many years. We probably girdled, I don't know, maybe 1,000 aspen in the overall property. We had quite a lot. Okay, so we've gotten rid of the weeds and the trees on the south slope, gotten rid of a lot of them in the savanna along the ridge, but we're not done, because in fact, the trees and the weeds and the brush all grow again. Even though you've cut and treated with herbicide on the cut stems, in fact, another alternative is to treat the trees with basal bark application of herbicide. That works very well also. But many of these species don't give up easily. They have to, they will send up resprouts, which have to be dealt with. I've made a list of the weeds, both woody weeds, trees and brush, and the forby trees, the flowers and such. The ones in red are the ones that we have found to be more problematical than others. I realized, I think late last night, that I hadn't added sumac to the woody problems. We had a lot of trouble with sumac also. Quite like the aspen, they have to be dealt with in a special way. The same, not girdling, but basal bark treatment and repeated treatment for sumac. They also grow in a clonal manner. The grasses are a problem. Reed canary grass is a terrific problem that we've been dealing with the help of contractor, and the cattails as well. A few cattails are good, but a lot of cattails tend to fill in the wetland that you want to have high quality. Smooth brome is a non-native grass that is also dealt with. Speaking of which, this is brome grass here, all the green. What I always say is early in the spring, if it's green, it's not good. If it's green, it's bad. Because the prairie seeds, the prairie plants, tend to be warm season plants. And so by June and July, everything's warmed up and the prairie plants grow very well. Early in the season, in May, the prairie plants are not growing yet, mostly non-native. Early spring ephemerals will grow, granted, but the grasses that grow, primarily here, you see brome grass, which is farm grass, and it could also have some quack grass or some orchard grass. Primarily it's brome. This can be handled in a couple of ways. One way is to interseed, that is to put seeds down, prairie seeds down, and eventually they will grow and at least be a competition for the brome. The way that we found worked very well at this season, when the grass is only 3 or 4 inches tall, early in the season, it can be sprayed with a foliar low concentration of Roundup. Roundup kills only green stuff, things that are growing. Since the prairie plants are not growing yet, as you see, it's all brown up here where the remnant prairie would be. So the Roundup only kills the green stuff. And that green stuff is brome grass, which is non-native and certainly not desirable. It worked very well, and we used that quite a lot over the years. Later in the season, in the summer, there's lots of growth of the of brush resprouts and of weeds from the seed bank. There's a lot of work to do here. It's way better than it was at the beginning when it was a solid wall of brush and weeds. But what do? Well, you get rid of the bushes, you get rid of the resprouts. And you can see a picture of that happening here in a different area. There's a guy, Todd Shoemate is up the hill here with a weed whacker, a steel weed whacker. The weed whacker has a saw blade on it, and he's cutting the stems of the brush. He's being followed by a couple of workers here. We usually had 3, maybe 4, depending on the speed of the cutter, following and with hand sprayers of herbicide and treating each cut stem. So a shrub like this will have maybe 20 stems. You treat every one of those cut stems, and it doesn't remove them in one go, but it slowly improves over the years. And we've got pretty good control of brush now in this area. It's very labor intensive, but also very effective. That's the trouble, isn't it? If you work really hard and do it right, it does help. So we had lots of weeds, of course. We inherited those from the early farming and from the neglect. They're basically non-native plants. The sweet clover and parsnips both have deep roots, tap roots, and you see we were part of an intern program for a number of years, and these are college kids and who are in restoration ecology programs at their schools, and they're holding parsnip predator shovels, sharpened pointed shovels that you can cut the root with of the sweet clover, large sweet clover or the parsnip plants, and then they're killed successfully. They're biennial plants, and so if they get removed and aren't allowed, don't let them make seed, that's the whole idea. The trouble with sweet clover is that the seeds are said to persist in the soil, remain viable for 80 to 100 years. So every year you've got new sweet clover coming. But if you persist and don't let the seeds form and fall into the soil, you do get ahead, and you have to be persistent, and you're in it for the long haul. but the rewards are great because you get a much better native population of plants growing. Another type of weed is Canada thistle. Most of the thistles that you see are in property are non-native. They're biennial, and so they're pretty easy to get rid of if you make sure that they don't make seeds. Canada thistle, on the other hand, is perennial and sends out runners, also rhizomes. And the best way we found to get rid of large infestations is to simply mow them. This is a walk-behind mower being run probably by one of our earlier workers, Paul Meckler. This works quite well. It reduces the best is to mow it just after the flowering season, but well before the successful seed formation. So the plants are not permitted to make new seed, and the vegetative plant is removed. Might have to be done again the following season or later in the same season. And after a year or two, though, there'd only be a few resprouts, and they can be hit with a backpack sprayer and foliar concentration of herbicide. Works pretty well. Walnut resprouts are another problem. You cut and treat a walnut, you'd think that would take care of it, but the root collar on a walnut must be something special, because cut and treat the tree trunk and it resprouts, as you see here on the right. And either in the summer, as shown here, or summer or fall, or in the winter, before they green up again, they can be cut and treated. They'll still resprout, probably, some of them, but after several years, then you've usually got them beat. And we still get walnut resprouts, but they show up quite significantly. They're easy to spot, and so they're not too hard to get rid of. So we're aware that we have to work on the resprouts, the brambles, the brush, but what else can we do to make restoration work better and to inhibit the growth of the plants that we don't want, and to encourage the growth of the plants that we do want? This is where fire comes in. Prescribed burns are very important and useful in restoration work. Here you see a burn on the south slope. This is the same south slope that you saw in the early slides where it was completely brushed in. This is a much more recent photo, and you see that the prairie grasses are doing very well. These are Bur Oak trees here. They have thick bark and they're resistant to the fire. Here's another prairie burn. This is a planted prairie. We'll see more of that in a few minutes. But you ring the prairie with burn with a fire, and it will move into the center all the way around, and it's very, very useful at inhibiting the removing the top growth of weeds and brush. Here's another way of making burn piles. This one's being made and burned at the same time. It's quite efficient. We're doing this in the winter, and so we can build the brush pile and get rid of it as we go. It's a good way to do work where you have close by trees and fuel. And here's a burn in our savannas. this is a prairie in the foreground, but we're burning one of the savanna areas that's been cleared out. As you see, it's quite open and the leaf litter is burning well. Sometimes the savanna burns will hit an area where there's a lot of savanna grasses and leaves, and you get a burst of big flames. Very popular for the pyromaniacs that come and help, but with good fire breaks, it's not a worry, and gets rid of a lot of the leaf litter and encourages growth of the savanna plants. We had some agricultural fields that had been used on the property before we bought it, before probably hadn't been planted in recent history. Well, a couple of them had been rented by neighbors, but at any rate, we learned, I learned it from beginning in the early days. I learned what sort of plants we had and what the time for collecting seeds was and how to do this. As you see here, we're collecting seeds from the plants that are early to bloom and early to make seeds. It's a all summer and fall process to collect the seeds, because here you see yellow coneflower. It's just blooming, so those seeds won't be ready to collect until the fall. Here's a photo of some of our early seed collecting. This is little blue stem seed, and in the bags below, quite a wide collection of a different kind of seed in each of the bags to dry. So we wanted, as I said, we wanted to plant some of the agricultural fields. They were, we had them enrolled in the CRP program, that is crop reduction program. There's federal funds for not planting the sloping fields, which are very prone to erosion. With crops planted on a sloping field, erosion is inevitable. With a prairie planted on a sloping field, there is no erosion. The prairie plants are deep rooted and work very well to stabilize the ground. So we planted prairie in, here's an old field, had been an ag field. At this point, it was all reverted to just farm grasses and weeds. We had the local corn, local ag, the Farm Bureau come and spray the field. The result of that is shown here. This field, everything that was green has been killed. It's ready to be planted. This field is the one I showed you earlier with the white oak savanna. At this point, the savanna hasn't been cleared, but the ag field has just been planted on this day. This is November 14th, 1999, fairly early days. These people have just finished helping plant this field. We cordoned it off into half-acre plots and marked each one, marking them with these orange cones, put the appropriate mixes of prairie seeds in buckets in each of the plots. And so each person had a plot to plant, walked back and forth, scattering the seeds in their half-acre plot. And it's good to have a lot of friends because it helps with the planting. Planting prairies is a very enjoyable, well-attended volunteer event. These people are being rewarded, looks like, with snacks and lunch and some soda probably. Here's the first growing season. You see it's all green. These are all pretty bad plants. Have grown up from the seed bank in the soil. And what happened to all our prairie seeds? Well, they're there, they're growing, but they're only an inch or two tall. So in order to get sunlight down to those prairie seeds, you ask yet another neighbor who's a farmer, has a really good flail mower, to come and mow the grass, the non-native farm grass that like smooth brome, for example, that has grown up down to about a 6-inch height. And that way the sunshine can get down to the little prairie plants, and they will be able to grow. You generally mow a new prairie planting about once a month, 2 or 3 times during the summer, and the prairie plants get a good start. This is that same prairie with the same white oak savanna, which is now, as you'll notice, cleared several years later. It's a good quality prairie full of a lot of, looks like a lot of Indian grass, the brown, good prairie grasses, lots of good forbs, quite a good diversity. The other thing that you can do with the seeds you've collected from the savannas is interseed. And what I mean by that is you don't kill everything and then put the seeds down on bare ground, because the savanna and the non-remnant prairie, say on the south slope and the open savanna areas, have a lot of residual native plants growing there already. So what we wanted to do was increase the diversity and increase the numbers of plants, of desirable plants growing. So we interseeded, collected savanna seeds, all the savanna specialists that grow only in the partial shade, as well as prairie seeds for the open areas where there weren't any trees. And they grow quite well. And as you see here, after several years of clearing and then subsequent interseeding, this is a pretty good looking oak savanna. Here's another view of the original big Bur oak that I showed you across from the driveway down near Pleasant Valley Road. You see that we've cleared out the whole oak savanna behind, going up the hill. The birch tree is still there. We've helped it survive the frequent burns that have helped the savanna restoration. So that's essentially the end of what I have to say. I think I forgot to mention another of the weeds that's been very problematical to us, the Canada goldenrod. We've treated that. It's one of our biggest problems. I don't know how I could have forgotten it, but we treat that like many of the other weeds. Can try just mowing it, or we can try treating it with herbicide. That works, but it's a long process. I want to say thank you to the people that are responsible for this restoration to have been done. As I pointed out in the beginning, certainly Tom and I couldn't have done it ourselves all. We would have done a very few acres out of the 140 acres that it totals. We learned a huge amount about restoration in the early days from Mark Martin up at Goose Pond. He was very helpful, shared the seeds that we needed to have good prairie plantings. Rich Henderson has been very helpful. He helped us learn how to do prescribed burns and has helped us learn a huge amount about all of the savanna restoration in particular. In the very early days, we had help with plant surveys from Paul West, who was shown in one of the photos here, who I worked with at the Nature Conservancy. And the other original survey, which pointed out to us that we had a potentially valuable, restorable property, was a young guy named Brian Pruka, who was working on a master's degree at the University in Madison. And his project was to recognize and survey the oak savannas in the unglaciated area, in the driftless area. So he asked us if he could come out to our property, and he showed us what we had and told us what a possibly marvelous opportunity for restoration we had. The reason I point out Brian so specifically is that he went on to be one of the founding members. It was his idea to have the Blue Mounds area project exist. And he was their earliest ecological worker. Other people that have helped us in the restoration are the ones who've actually done the work. The current work is being done primarily by Amanda Budjack and Susan Slapnick. They work for Pleasant Valley 2 days a week when the weather permits. And Amanda is our land manager, and she tells us what to do and takes care of making sure that it gets done. She's very good at her job, and I'm happy to work for her. We've had very good luck with people that have come to work for us. Willis Brown was one of the early ones, Paul Mickler. They came and did huge amounts of work, as did Pat Schrader in the early days, and Paul West as well. Willis Brown and Paul Mickler formed their own restoration contracting company and ran that company very well for a number of years. An offshoot of their company, which we now have working when needed, is Craig Annan and Integrated Restoration. They come when Amanda, who also works for them on her off days from Pleasant Valley, they come when we need more than just a couple of people for larger projects. At any rate, they're the reason that Pleasant Valley looks as good as it does, and they've all been a pleasure to work with for sure. It takes care of what I had to say. I want to point out that if you'd like a more coherent and well-written and well-illustrated story of Pleasant Valley, you could check out the Pleasant Valley website. It's pleasantvalleyconservancy.org. My husband set up that website, and it's a very good one. And also offered on there are a couple of ebooks, which tell the story of Pleasant Valley. It's a free download ebook, and there's a link there so that you can see them. Anyway, thanks very much for your attention. I think we've probably got time for some questions. Micah will probably be able to run that part of the program.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathie, for walking us through those many years of restoration. And having walked Pleasant Valley many times, as well, I'm sure many of our listeners here can attest to the hard work that you and so many have put into it. It's absolutely delightful. What a gem to have here in Dane County. So we have a question from Brooke Lewis. Are there plants that you grow into plugs before planting rather than directly seeding into the landscape? And if there are, what species or what growing method do you use?
Well, what a good question. That's a section that I thought I probably wouldn't have time for. So your question is perfect. Yes, over the years, I've grown a number of plants to plant out at Pleasant Valley. Primarily, I grow the ones that are either very rare or very hard to get to grow, simply by putting them in a seed mix and tossing them out onto the ground. The primary one, I think, would be the purple milkweed. I've got some more photos that we can just, that's purple milkweed that you see there. That's state endangered. It's a savanna specialist. That means it doesn't grow in prairies. It doesn't grow in the woods. It grows in the parts of the savanna that are partially shaded. They need some sun, they need some shade. They don't, they're very specific in what they want. It's probably why they're endangered, because there aren't very many savannas. As you saw at the beginning, most of our savannas in the driftless area are completely overgrown, and so there's not much sun that gets into them. So we did have some purple milkweeds flower when there was enough light for them to be able to do so. I collected the pods and collected the seeds, and I was not willing to just throw those seeds out onto the ground and hope that they would grow. I think I probably tried that early on, and I never saw anything grow from them. When I grew them in pots or in a flat, I got essentially 95% germination. So it's not the seeds that are difficult to grow. I grew them in flats and then transplanted them into pots. They have tap roots, so actually I used pots that were tubes, especially meant for plants with with tap roots. I started out by growing them in my basement with grow lights, and they made rather spindly plants. I later talked my way into some greenhouse space, and that was very good. The plants grew much better with very bright light and warm temperatures. And I could plant those out, and I would say that I probably had 85% survival into the second year. So it's a very successful way to do for plants that you either don't have enough seed to squander or that are difficult to grow. A plant that's difficult to grow, even though the seeds are plentiful, is, let me think. Oh, shoot. I've pulled a blank on the name of the plant. At any rate, there are some of the plants which, when you throw them out onto the ground, they simply don't grow. In that case, I had a number of the seeds, and I planted them very heavily into a flat, and a few plants did grow. And so I could grow those and plant them out into the savanna, and they grew very well, and they're still growing. Another, to go back to the purple milkweed, another reason it's state endangered, not only because there aren't many savannas, but because it's very flaky. It'll grow one year and flower and make seed pods. The next year it won't grow, but the following year it will grow. It may or may not bloom. And if it blooms, it may or may not make pods. Last year, I got one pod from several plants that had grown and bloomed. Other years we get more pods. So whether or not you grow seedlings, that's a lot of work. It's very labor intensive. And I have always used it only for plants that either were very hard to get, hard to make germinate, or valuable for some other reason. I've grown butterfly milkweed simply because it's so very pretty. And I've been able to plant plants of that where I want them, where they'll show. And wood lilies, on the other hand, are also very hard to come by. The seeds may be difficult to get for individuals, but for those, I wouldn't recommend trying to grow seedlings, because the first year you get 1 inch high leaf. The second year you maybe get 2 or 3 leaves, inch long. The third year you might get a 3-inch tall plant. They don't bloom for maybe usually about 6 years. And to keep track of a plant for that long is beyond my capability. They do grow if you scatter them, but I've found that if with wood lilies, I scrape a little area and put 4 or 5 seeds down, cover the seeds and stomp on them, and go here and there in an area where they're likely to like growing. And I've been very successful at having that work. Other people find that if they have enough seeds, they can put them, just scatter them about, and they get some growth. We've gotten some growth, but I find that it's better if you scrape them in. Hopefully that answers the question.
Sure. And there's another question asking you to go in a bit more detail on how you handled the reed canary grass and the cattails. So they're having a similar issue and are a little concerned about using herbicides. So it sounds like the question is directed at how did you mitigate or minimize your use of herbicide in controlling those two plants?
Well, that's a good question too. Reed canary is a terrible problem. There are grass-specific herbicides that work especially well on reed canary. And quite frankly, how I handled control of reed canary is to hire our contractor to come and spray it for us. Craig Gannon and his crew come with can't remember the herbicide, clethodim, something like that, I think, which works especially well on reed canary, but they also add in oil that helps it spread and stick to the canary grass stems and leaves, and makes it penetrate better. I think if you don't like herbicide, then, well, to be rather blunt, I think if you don't like herbicide, then you should learn to like reed canary grass. And the same goes for buckthorn and probably goldenrod and a lot of other weeds. Sweet clover and parsnip you can get rid of by hand pulling and using the shovels, as I pointed out earlier. But a lot of these plants that are undesirable are very hard to get rid of without the use of herbicide. There are herbicides that work specifically. You don't have to spray them in a broad area. You can spray them only where it's needed. And I think the collateral damage is relatively small compared to the advantage of getting rid of the non-native and invasive plants.
Wonderful. It looks like there aren't any additional questions. And anything else you want to mention while we have our attention and interest, Kathie?
Well, I don't think so, really. I did write down jotted down a note, some of those Bur Oak trees that we've been talking about that are up on the ridge top. There was a project run out of UW Plattsburgh, a project to make coring, bore holes in the oak trees to see how old they were. Their project was related to the climate change, and they wanted to see what the weather in the past had been. So from a tree core, you can look at the width of the tree rings and tell what the weather was like back through the life of the tree. And that was a very interesting and profitable or productive project. We know what the weather was for the for the most recent, 80 years, because our Weather Bureau has very good records. The trees that they sampled at Pleasant Valley were what they thought would be the oldest ones that we had. And they cored, I think it was maybe 18 trees. The oldest one they found dated from 1736. That made it 286 years old as of now, which takes it back not to the original Puritans at Plymouth Rock, but well before the before the Revolution, the American Revolutionary War, well before we had any European settlement here. 1736 was a long time ago. Those trees have been growing ever since, right where they are now. And that's what really gives me the pleasure in the restoration we've done, to know that trees are growing happily once again. That the tree ring information that they got was so interesting, because that took the weather reports back for another 200 years more than our Weather Bureau has done. And interestingly, the overlap between the last 80 years of the Weather Bureau and the most recent 80 years of the tree rings coincide very, very well, which implies, therefore, proves that the 200 years before that is also good weather data. In fact, they went down to Mineral Point, to some of those earliest establishments, mostly the roadhouses and what are now bars and hotels in Mineral Point. And those buildings are made with 12-inch oak beams back a long time. And so that they were able to get back another 100 years by coring the oak beams in the buildings, because those trees were old when ours were not all that old. And so the collection of their weather data was marvelous. And of course, we benefited hugely from knowing more about our Bur Oaks. They're the oldest and most fire resistant. So they have a fascinating story to tell.
Excellent. We have another question or two. One, which is, how would you recommend folks who want to contribute to your work and the work of others in preserving, protecting, restoring Pleasant Valley Conservancy? How would you recommend folks get involved? And then I have another two questions, I guess, after that one.
Anyone that would like to donate to Pleasant Valley Conservancy restoration work would be more than welcome. We, my husband and I set up a tax exempt foundation some years ago, which we called Savannah Oak Foundation. And so anybody that donates to Pleasant Valley or Savannah Oak are donating to a tax exempt organization. So it's of course deductible. But other ways to participate are we also Savannah Oak also takes care of restoration, continuing restoration work at Black Earth Rettenman Prairie. We have work parties about once a month at Black Earth Rettenman Prairie, and always welcome volunteers of all ages and skills. We can put you to work. And our work parties are always announced on the Prairie Enthusiasts website. They have a MailChimp notice that goes out, which notifies members and anyone that looks at the website of when the work parties are. We'd love to have you. We do have occasional work parties at Pleasant Valley, and if anyone were interested, they could inquire, and certainly anyone that wanted to could come and help plant seeds or collect seeds or cut brush. We'd be happy to have people who were able to coincide their efforts with Amanda and Susan who worked there. You had other questions?
Yeah, one that is, do you have a favorite moment if you, in the whole process through the years? And I'm going to tag on one there too, which is, do you have a favorite plant, Oak Savannah plant, if you can pick one?
Well, a favorite moment, boy, that's pretty hard. No, what I have found really interesting over, my golly, what is it? It's 25 years of this, is that even on the days when I'm sort of grumpy and tired before I set out to go work at Pleasant Valley, I go out, when the weather is a little bit more comfortable than this. I try to get out there at least 2 days a week, hopefully coinciding with when Amanda and Susan work on Tuesday and Thursday, and probably on a weekend day as well. And, pulling sweet clover, you think it's got to be the worst work in the whole world, but your sense of accomplishment is always a huge reward. Or cutting brush, cutting and treating goldenrod. And so I think there's no one particular moment, but to my amazement, every time I go out there, I have a good time. And I'm usually doing work that many people would think is crazy. It's horrible work. And yeah, pulling sweet clover is horrible work, but well, my daughter claims that I'm obsessed by the restoration. And I don't think I'm obsessed. And she said, well, yeah, she thinks I am, but that's okay. It's a good obsession. And I have to say that I always enjoy being out there, and I enjoy what I do. I can't remember, what was the second part of the question, or the next question?
Favorite plant, favorite prairie or Oak Savannah plant?
Oh yeah, well, I forgot to advance. I think the purple milkweed is, because it's so rare, it's such a pleasure when you see the reward. Early in the season, however, it's hard not to love the bird's foot violet. It's very early. Actually, even earlier, I think the earliest one is the little prairie buttercup, a little bitty yellow buttercup that's about 3 inches tall, comes up in the mowed lanes. And anything that blooms early in the season is ever so welcome. Here's the wood lily I told you about. And these are Turk's cap lily out in the wetland. Sorry, I didn't have time to talk about the wetland. We're so fortunate and lucky in the land that we bought, because it is marvelous land and with a capability of being restored to what you see today. And not all land is like that. I know some people who also bought land, and it turned out that they didn't have any remnant desirable stuff. And that makes it a lot less fun to restore, because more than restoring it, you're recreating. And anyway, and who doesn't like Golden Alexander? We have quite a lot of New Jersey tea as well. And those are all good. But if I had to choose one, I guess it would be the one that's so hard to have grow and come up again year after year. The purple milkweed is a wonderful plant. Anyway, it's hard. I don't really have one favorite. I mean, I like them all.
So in and amongst the many thank yous for your work and for your presentation, we have one more question. That is, how optimistic are you for the restoration movement in Dane County with all the broader rapid development expansion?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Years ago, the Thousand Friends had as their rather revolutionary idea that we should concentrate on having the population concentrated in the city and urban areas, and try to leave the rest of the landscape more open. Well, as you drive out Mineral Point and other places, other areas, you find that hasn't worked particularly well. I have to say that the town of Vermont is one of the more enlightened townships, because in our area, we have 35-acre zoning, and that tends to limit the density of population. And that's all to the good. On the other hand, the greater Madison area is one of the most popular places in the country. I keep reading. I wish it was a better kept secret. But we will keep growing, and we certainly need to try to control how much spread out we are. And it will take a lot of work. It's highly desirable to keep at least some areas of greenery and undeveloped area in and among the areas that we are building on. But what we really need is broader expanses. We were fortunate and lucky in having our land where it is. Hopefully we won't spread out in all directions forever. I don't know. I try to stay optimistic, but it's not easy in some areas.
Excellent. Thank you again, Kathie. No more questions so far, unless one pops up. Many thanks again for your presentation and for your contribution to the restoration movement and care of native habitat here in Dane County at Pleasant Valley Conservancy.